Welcome to this compilation of the most important animation tips for Blender 2.8. It'll be especially helpful if you're moving from 2.7, but even if you're new, you'll learn some new tricks. You can find the full course for free in the link below. Hope you enjoy.
So you've opened up Blender 2.8 to start animating and you're wondering where all the animation tools have gone. So the only one we have access to in our toolbar is the breakdowner tool. So if we hover over this and hold down the button, you can see we've got access to breakdowner, push and relax. And if we hover further, you'll see the actual shortcuts, which are Shift E, Control E and Alt E. And strangely, that was the only tool in Blender 2.79 that I actually used a hotkey for. Everything else I kind of just pushed the buttons that were on the screen. So where is everything hidden? It's all hidden inside our pose menu up here. So we have access to all the tools that you are used to. These ones are very important, the copy and the paste pose. So this is Control C, Control V and Shift Control V. We'll paste the mirrored pose. I'll show you how that works in a moment. And this is the propagate tool, which I use quite a lot, which is Alt P. Now the way that I remember what these symbols mean is it kind of looks like a car driving along the road, and if it went down the alternate route, it would have had a crash. So I go, oh, lucky we didn't take the alternate route. So Alt, that's how I remember it. So let's show you how it works. I'm just going to select all my bones in the viewport here, and I'm on frame 4, and with my mouse in the viewport, I'm going to hit Control C, and let's just paste it over here. So I'm going to paste this pose here, and I just pasted that pose to this frame on 26. Now, if I wanted to post the flip pose, Control, Shift, and V. So there we go. And what about the propagate pose? I use this tool quite a lot when I'm doing blocking. That is the Alt P. So we just hit Alt P and it'll bring up our menu, which of course is the same thing as going up here and choosing propagate. So there we go, So that is where everything is hiding. So the timeline inside Blender 2.8 has changed dramatically since the older versions in 2.7 and previous. So the first thing that you'll notice is it looks a lot more similar to the Dopesheet, and that is in fact because it is the Dopesheet. It's just a variation of the Dopesheet. So our keyframes here are looking different, but the hotkeys we're going to use are different as well. So we used to hit S and E to set the start and the end frame of our animation. That has now changed to Control Home to set the start and Control End to set the end frame. So that is how we set the start and the end. And if we want to get our alternate timeline up here, we can just obviously click this and set our new time range, or we can hit P to get a box select and then just go say, here is my alternate timeline. So that is in case we want to work on just a section of our animation without actually changing the start and the end frame of our output. So one other thing that could trip you up is because this is a Dopesheet, we can actually translate this around. So you might actually accidentally be animating away and then going, where are my keyframes? Just make sure that you haven't actually translated them off the screen. So that is one of the things to be wary of. But one of the good changes is we can actually edit our keyframes inside the timeline here. So if we want this keyframe that's on frame 4 to be on frame 3, we can just grab it and move it. We can box select all these guys and move it wherever we want. We want them over here. So that gives us a lot more flexibility inside the timeline, which is great. Now, one more thing about markers. If we hit M to set a marker here, we need to make sure that we hover over our little black line here and then hit Control M if we want to change the name of that. Let's just call it marker. Now, it's possible by default, you won't get the visual line here. If you're using factory settings, you probably will. But if you want to see the visual line, just make sure you check View, Show Marker Lines. And now you've got a line that shows where the marker is in line with. So that is the new timeline in a nutshell. All right, so let's have a look at a few changes that happen inside the Dopesheet or the action editor, which is all part of the same editor inside Blender 2.8 as it was in previous versions. So the first thing, if your channel groups are looking like this, all the rainbow colors, that's because it's displaying the armature settings, the bone groups, the colors that are associated with that. If we think that's distracting and we don't want it to show like that, we just go up here and we go show color groups and turn that off. Looks much better. Now that's exactly the same as previous versions of Blender. But the one thing that has changed is the default shape of our keyframes here. It used to be this kind of diamond shape for everything, but now these have different shapes depending on the handle types that we're using. So I'm just going to hit the V key to bring up our little menu here, and we can change what the handle types are doing. So V for vector is the way that I remember it. So we've got the free handle type, which is a diamond. Then we've got aligned, vector, automatic and auto clamp. So that's what the different shapes mean. Is that going to help me as an animator? I don't really think so, but you know, you never know. Maybe I will end up getting used to that. One other thing that you can do, if we go to the view menu, is we can show the curve extremes. And if we try and zoom in here, we kind of get to see there's little shapes or blobs at the top or the bottom, and that's going to kind of represent where, if that's an extreme of our curve. Now I'll just switch over to the graph editor just by hitting Control Tab, and you'll see, okay, like what I'm talking about is here is a peak of a curve, right? So let's jump back here. You can see, okay, that's what these shapes mean. Again, I don't think this is going to help me as an animator, but it's something that might help someone else. So that's good. Now, what does this big yellow bar mean? This means that our value from this point all the way over to here is not changing. But there is a new feature inside Blender 2.8. So if we go view, actually I'll change this to, I'll just link select them with the L key. That's going to select everything in that channel. And then if I hit T and change it to constant, you'll see that there's a green line that connects everything. And the green line represents constant interpolation. Of course, that might be distracting to you, or it might enhance the way that you work. If you want to turn that off, we just go show handles and interpolation, and that's going to get rid of that for you. So they're the new features. Make sure that you set up the way that you like to work and then save your user settings so that you can be as productive as possible when you're animating. One of the new features of Blender 2.8 is the ability to animate multiple characters that are in different armatures at the same time. So we do this by selecting pose mode for the actual two characters here. You can see I can move them both around. Now this is a handy feature in some instances, and sometimes it can actually get in the way. So you need to know how to change in and out of this mode. So the way we do that, it's actually going to remember the last state that you set this character in. So these are both in pose mode. So how do I only actually animate one at a time? Well, we need to select the one that we don't want to be in pose mode, change it back to object mode. So now everything is in object mode. And then when we select pose mode over here, this guy jumps into pose mode and this guy is still in our object mode. So when we animate in pose mode, it's not going to affect the other character. So how do we change this one back? Just select it again and then change it to pose mode. And now they're both in pose mode. So it's a little finicky how to jump in and out, but that's just one of the new features of Blender 2.8. Now, how do we activate our keying sets as well as auto keying inside Blender 2.8? Now, all of that is located in the keying menu here. So up the top here, we have our keying set. So let's just choose whole character selected bones only. That's what I want now. And we're not quite done. We need to make sure that we have this button enabled, and that will use our setting that we have up here. Now, why is it separated? I don't know, it just is. And to turn on auto keying, we can now just hit this button here. So if we just say grab and move this one, it's going to set a keyframe on that frame. I've just broken my animation, but you know what I mean. We can also insert a keyframe with the I key for insert. And if we want to delete a key, we can just hit Alt-I, and that's going to say, do you want to delete that keyframe? Yes, I do. You can see it is gone. So how do you actually link in a character for animation in Blender 2.8? Well, it's very similar to the old way of doing it, but rather than using a group, we're actually using a collection. So here I am inside my file, which contains my rig, and I just want to show you the setup. So I have one collection that is all in capital letters. This is just to make it easier to distinguish when we're looking at the list. And then I have two other collections that have the geometry and the actual rig in it. So this is the way that I like to set it up, so we can turn everything off, or we can turn the individual parts off, which makes it handy. Okay, so now I'm going to open up a new file and link it in. File, new, and we've got a blank file. Let's just delete everything we don't need. Now, before I'm going to link this in, I'm going to save it in the same location. So file, save as, and I'll just call this linked rig. And now let's go file, link, and it's automatically going to open up the location of this file. That's usually a quick way to navigate to where you want to be. So let's go into our rig file and let's go down to collection. So rather than group, so group is not there anymore. And then we want to choose that capital letter one, so the Melvin. So that's the one that we want to link in. And now we have access to our character inside this scene, but we need to make a proxy. We can do that in the object menu. We can go object, relations, make proxy. But if you know what the operator is called and you just don't know where to find it inside Blender 2.8, you can use the search function. That is by hitting F3, and then you can just type in proxy, and you'll see it here make proxy. So that's what we're going to do. Now, what are we going to make a proxy of? We want to make a proxy of the rig. So there we go. Now we can jump into pose mode and start animating this guy. Sadly, in 2.8, the dupli frames option is gone. So what am I talking about here? Here you can see I've got a little bit of a timing chart here, which is just a marker, which is using an animation curve, and I've set it to duplicate on the frame so that when I move it, you can see that my timing updates exactly in real time. So this uses the duplications under the frames here. Now, duplication was changed to instancing. Let's just jump over to 2.8. So I have my marker selected, and under the instancing, we only have none, verts, and faces. We no longer have the ability to show the dupli frames. So if you're looking for that feature, it is no longer in 2.8. I'm not sure whether it will be added back, but at this stage, you can stop looking. There is no way to do it at this present time. In this video, I just want to show you where these OpenGL buttons have gone in Blender 2.8, as well as when you do hit render, where it's going to display that render. So let's just hit F12, and it's going to render our scene from the active camera, and it's going to display it where we tell it to. So I have chosen image editor up here, and just to remind you what these buttons do, this is going to render a still image of our viewport, the OpenGL render of our viewport, and this one's going to do the whole animation range. So where has that gone in Blender 2.8? Let's have a look. So at first glance, it looks like it's gone, but it's not. The OpenGL renders are up here in the view menu. So if we want to do a still image, we just choose that one. And if we want to do a viewport render, we choose that option there. So let's just render our image there. And how do we decide where Blender is going to, how it's going to display that render? Well, up here in the render menu, we go to display mode, and we can choose what do we want? We want image editor, new window, or so I prefer the image editor. That is my preference. And just another tip for everyone, if you happen to go render animation and you get this error down here, that is because this file that I'm working on is not saved. So it's trying to save it to somewhere, but it doesn't know the location. So it goes, hang on, you need to tell me where to save it. So that's what that error message was all about. There we go, just showing you where all the new stuff is in Blender 2.8.
I'd like to show you a practical example of the difference between the checkbox icon next to collections, the eyeball icon, and the monitor icon in the outliner. Because at first glance, they appear to all do very similar things. The eyeball icon hides it, of course. The monitor icon also appears to hide it, and the checkbox icon just gets rid of everything. Now, there are some subtle differences here that especially come into play when you're working with linking and animation files. So for this example, I'm going to be working with two files. This is the original one that I built the rig in, or Wayne Dixon built the rig in, and it's just a asset for first person animation, which is why it's missing the head and torso and all that stuff. But what I'm going to do is drag this over to the side and also look at this new file here on the right. This is not exactly how it would actually work, but it's going to allow us in this video to quickly switch between the two and make sure we're clear on which file is which. So in the file on the right, this one's just completely empty, and this is where I would import or link a bunch of assets from different files so I can animate them all together in one place. So let's go to File and Link, and then navigate to that .blend file, go to Collections, and import the character collection. Once we go ahead and link that, you can see that we now have a linked asset here with everything displayed. Now, when it comes to animation, I don't really want to see all those widgets. I really only want to see the control rig. So if we go ahead and hide the widgets with the eyeball icon and also hide the deformation bones, this is all we need to animate. It's very, very simple. Especially for the first person animation, we really only need a couple of these bones. So in order to get rid of the mess, let's go ahead and hide that. And let's try saving the file and reloading the other one on the right. So let's hit Control S to save over here. And in the file on the right, let's go to File and Revert, which is going to reload that asset. So you can see it's reloaded it. However, all of those things are still visible. The reason for this is because the eyeball icon here is actually associated with the view layer and not the objects themselves. So if we create a new view layer here, you can see that as we switch between them, what we have visible with the eye icon is different. Now, if we were to uncheck this instead of using the eyeball icon, you can see that all of these have completely disappeared, all of the different settings and whatnot. However, if we save this, and again, let's go to File and Revert, then everything is indeed still visible. Again, because this is tied to the view layer, you can see if we switch view layers, that's still active. It's not tied to the object itself. And since we're linking the objects and not the view layer, then again, this is not going to affect it. What we need to do is actually turn off the monitor icon, which is disable in viewport. And since that's tied to the object itself, once we save the file and revert, it'll carry over those settings. Let's also do that for the deformation bones as well, because we don't need to see those. Hit Control S, and again go to File and Revert to reload this asset. And there we go. Now we only have the bones that we need to see. And you'll also notice that as we switch view layers, you can see that this monitor icon, disable from viewport, is consistent between them. So no matter which view layer you're on, those will always be off. Now, one more quirk of working with these in animation files is that what we want to do is create a proxy. So in order to actually animate these bones and move them in the new file, we need to go to Object, Relations, and Make Proxy, find that control rig, and there we go. Now we can select it via the character proxy here in the outliner in the 3D viewport, and we can switch over to pose mode and do whatever we need to do. One thing you might notice though, and I'm not seeing it too much on this rig, but you will see it in some others, probably if you're using like octahedral bones or bendy bones or something other than just super thin wire geometry. But sometimes you'll find that the bones are drawing directly on top of each other and causing Z-fighting issues and some overlap, and it's just really weird. And that's because once you create a proxy, it'll show up no matter what, even if the original is hidden from the viewport. So what we actually need to do in order to get rid of any weird overlap or Z-fighting issues and only see the proxy rig is we need to disable from view the original control rig in that first file. So once we do that, save that, and then go to File and Revert, you can see that we don't actually see any bones here at all. But once we go to Object and Relations and Make Proxy, grab in that control rig, then we're going to be able to see it just fine and animate with it, and we won't have any overlapping issues. The weird thing about this though is that if you are handing this file off to somebody else, say you're selling this on Blender Market, or maybe you're on a team and you need to give this to somebody else to animate, they might open up the file and say, hey, there's no rig. You either forgot to rig this or I just don't see the rig, but it's just because it's disabled from view. Now, Blender 2.79 had a pretty nice system for this with the dupli visibility here once you added it to a group, and that would make sure that only certain things are visible once you link it to another file, but they'd still be visible in the original file. And that was a pretty nice thing. But there's no such thing here in Blender 2.8, so you've got to use these disable from viewport toggles, and that, as I explained, can get a little bit odd. Now, later on in the Blender 2.8 series, maybe 2.82 or so, there's going to be a dynamic override system that will make this a whole lot easier and make a lot more sense than the proxy linking system that we have now. But for the time being, this is how we need to do it. Weight painting is mostly the same as in 2.79, but slightly easier to work with thanks to the tools and some new overlay options. It's really nice just to be able to use the draw tool and draw straight on the mesh and switch to other tools like blur or average and just kind of smooth things out without having to actually switch the brush itself and mess with the blend modes and all of that. It's nice to have all of these over here in the toolbar as separate tools. Though a lot of these, like for example gradient, that's of course a very, very useful one, but you can also just bring it up anytime by holding the Alt key. You don't necessarily have to switch the tool itself. So it's still worth knowing the shortcuts so that you don't have to constantly go over to the toolbar. I don't know if the sample tools were in 2.79 or not. I never used them there, and maybe they're just exposed better or they just are new. But either way, they're very helpful. You can either use the sample weight to just pick a weight here, and you can see that the weight changes over here in the tool settings, or you can use the sample vertex group, which is really cool. And when you left click over an area, it'll tell you what group that's assigned to. So let's say we have a couple different groups, and let's say I paint some right on his noggin there. Switch over to group 1, and I use the sample vertex group, you can see exactly which ones are under the mouse. And I can switch between them. So that's a really helpful new addition. But beyond that, you can also use your face and vertex selection masking as usual, but it's a little bit easier to see this time. So if we switch over to face selection, then we can either shift and left click to select faces and paint only in those selected areas, or we can use our selection tools. I like to use circle select when I'm doing weight painting because it just seems the most natural and most painting-like, but you could use box selection and things like that. Of course, you can still hit B and use box selection that way at any time. You can also hit V and switch over to vertex select mode at any time, and that works well. And you can still, again, just shift left click or hit B to box select, or use your selection tools as usual. You can use Alt A to clear your selection just like you would in edit mode or object mode. There are also a couple new overlay options which make this really nice. First, there's an opacity, which is nice if you're working on a character and you're using textures and you want to see whether your deformations are stretching those textures or not. You can just lower the opacity and actually see what's going on underneath. You can also set zero weights. If you set that to active instead of none, then it will show up as black instead of just blue. So you can see where it's absolutely zero, shows up as black. And if we use the sample weights tool, we can see that even the dark blue right next to it is like 0.00002, while the black is actually 0. So you can tell where something is completely unassigned, which is helpful in some circumstances, but usually I'll just leave it on none. Show weight contours is a really fun tool and it helps you just better see the transitions between these areas, and it looks like a topographical map, and I like to have it on just because it looks pretty cool. It's also useful, but frankly I just think it's fun to look at. You can also use show wire, which shows the wire all the time, even when you're not using face and vertex selection masking, and it's a little bit better than just the regular wireframe here because it's not selected and just seems to blend better with the mesh. And so that's all that's new with weight paint mode in 2.8. And again, since the weights are just overlays, you can just turn them off at any time, and you can still actually paint the weights even with overlays off. Just see your regular mesh and toggle them back on. So again, that might be helpful if you're working with characters and you don't want all that stuff to get in the way.
All right, so you're trying to do some weight painting inside Blender 2.8 and it's not quite working the way it used to. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm trying to select our mesh here and then jump into weight paint mode, and then I want to select the bones and start weight painting them, but I can't. And that is because in our edit menu here, we have lock object modes enabled. So when we disable that, it now lets us select other objects when we're working in this particular mode. So now I've selected that bone, but it's going to jump to that object, but that was already set in object mode. So if I wanted to weight paint, go over to pose mode and then just select our mesh again. And now when I select any of our body parts, it's going to jump to that vert group for us. So there we go. Just make sure that you disable this one if you want to do weight painting.
Drivers are one thing that haven't really changed from Blender 2.79 to 2.8. How they work is exactly the same, but how you get to them is much easier. So let's say that we want to drive the value of this cube's Z location with this cube's X location. Previously, that would have been a pretty big ordeal, and you'd have to go into the drivers editor and make all these different changes. But thankfully now it's very, very quick. All we need to do is select the object that we want to drive and find the property that we want to change, in this case the Z location, right click and just add driver. Once we do that, it'll bring up this new pop-up. So let's just choose the cube 001 object, and X location is already the default, and we're good to go. Now when we select this, it already just works. If we want to edit it, we can right click and edit driver, or we can right click and open drivers editor, which will bring a little pop-up window with the drivers tab already open and everything already selected. So it's much easier to get to than having to switch to the animation workspace and open it up that way. You'll also notice that we have a little icon for things that are driven, which is just a handy little visual indicator in case you don't have the purple highlight. This also is an indicator that you can't keyframe this, because normally clicking on these will add or remove a keyframe. But when you click on the little driver icon, nothing happens. I'll also note that drivers are now much more stable thanks to the dependency graph overhaul, and they update much better. You can also go ahead and remove this just by right-clicking and delete drivers or delete single driver. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful. Check the link below for the full course of over 50 lessons, all of which are completely free. See you there.